I had to lose 30% of my body before I started to use 100% of what was left. You know, COVID could be your 30%. You know, where has it put you back? What could you do moving forward?
Thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Very well, thank you, Maria. Very well.
Super. Have I fitted you in between your training?
I've got a session booked for this afternoon. So yeah, absolutely. I'll be back on the treadmill at the university, and the 3-year cycle will feel much longer when I get on that beast of a machine.
Fantastic, brilliant. Well, I love speaking to people who are focused on their jobs and on their work. That's brilliant. So listen, I know a little bit about your story, but not everybody will do. And I'd love to hear about how things started. And you haven't always been an amputee. You weren't born the way you are now. Tell us how that happened.
Okay, so I was an able-bodied 15-year-old, and I was rushed into hospital with. Well, if you look at my symptoms, it was quite scary. It was the first day back to school after the Christmas holidays. I was 15. I told my parents I didn't feel great. I went off and got up into bed. It was January. There was lots of flu around. We didn't think anything of it. I got up and I vomited twice in the night. My dad woke me up in the morning to see how I was. And I said I didn't feel great, to put it politely. I got up to go to the toilet and I collapsed on the landing. My dad heard me fall down, ran upstairs, scooped me up, put me in my parents' bed, and my mum saw a rash appearing on my chest. So she was asking my little sister to bring a glass because she knew the glass test for meningitis. My little sister didn't understand. She kept bringing a glass of water, and mum was saying, no, just a glass. She pressed the glass down on the rash. It didn't disappear. So they called out a doctor who called an ambulance. And from my very first symptoms to life support machine was 12 hours. And from the rash appearing to life support machine was just 1 hour. So I had, the technical term is acute respiratory and renal failure from meningococcal septicemia. So meningitis type C.
Wow, that's scary stuff. How wonderful that your mother knew how to check for it and that they reacted so quickly and they didn't just send you off to school and say, you know, I mean, oh my goodness. So, wow, that's incredible.
And on that, we probably should say, look, I don't expect anybody listening to this to become an expert on meningitis, but I think if someone's poorly and you get that gut feeling that something's not right, when I've met people who've been through similar experiences, you always get that kind of alarm bell at the back of your head that says something's not right. Get that person checked out. And I'm sure all the doctors would say you would rather that, you know, it was a false alarm than something like what happened to me would happen to somebody else.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And the fact that you have to act so quickly, I didn't realise that it was an hour from rash appearing to being on life support. That's quite scary in itself. How did you get into elite sport, though, from that? Because, I mean, that's not something you would immediately think of doing.
No, not at all. So, yeah, I spent a year in hospital and it was a really, really tough time. I had to relearn how to walk. I should probably mention for people listening, actually, yes, I'm an amputee. So I'm a bilateral below knee amputee. I'm missing both my legs below the knees and the tips of the majority of my fingers. So it means I'm rubbish at charades. So put my hand up, you'd never know how to yeah, so I left hospital a year later as kind of presented with this new situation where I used a wheelchair and I used prosthetic legs to get around. But at this point, I wasn't an athlete. I was just getting on with my life. And to be honest with you, I just fell into sport because I agreed to things I shouldn't agree to. I wanted to raise some money for the Meningitis Research Foundation. So I entered a 10K race in my everyday wheelchair. There was 2,000 runners in this race. I was the only person doing it in a wheelchair. I started at the very front. Every single runner overtook me and I came at the back, but I loved it and got myself a second-hand racing wheelchair. And that led me into doing the London Marathon. I did the London Marathon twice, second time quite fast. And that's where my journey started with wheelchair rugby.
Fantastic. There must be a huge difference between a racing wheelchair and a normal wheelchair. That must have been very hard.
Yeah, because of the camber of the road, you end up pushing with one arm. So you're kind of going along. If the camber's one way, you're pushing with one arm and then you go the other way. And all the racers are patting me on the back saying, well done, and overtaking me. But I literally came at the back. But it was a good learning point. I really enjoyed the race. And I've got a fantastic photo in my house of me doing it. And it was a good starting point. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend anybody in a wheelchair to go and do something like that in an everyday wheelchair. It's probably not a good idea.
And how did you get into the sort of wheelchair rugby, which is actually, and tell me why people call it murder ball as well, which I think is a fabulous term, murder ball. It sort of gives you all sorts of visions. How did you get into that?
Okay, so I'll do a brief history lesson on wheelchair rugby to talk about the murder ball story, and then I'll talk about how I got into it. So it was invented in Canada in the 70s for people looking for an alternative to wheelchair basketball. At the time, that was the only team sport. And there were some quadriplegics. So quadriplegic means you've broken your neck up really quite high, that were just too disabled to play wheelchair basketball. The net's up quite high. They couldn't, it's quite a heavy ball. They couldn't throw it up, and they just couldn't compete with, you know, if you've got someone who's a single leg amputee and you're that disabled, you're going to really struggle. So they came up with this new sport where you could crash into each other. They called it murder ball. They then struggled to get corporate sponsorship for a sport named murder ball, and they couldn't enter it into the Paralympics called murder ball. So they changed the name to wheelchair rugby. That is why it's nothing like rugby. We play on a basketball court, but that's where it came from. So they literally, it's daft really, isn't it? They couldn't enter it in the Paralympics called murder ball, so they changed the name to rugby, but that's how it started. So for me, I was at the Racing Track Championships and I got chatting to a couple of guys who played it. And, you know, Paralympic sport didn't have the exposure back then. I'd never seen it. And I was saying, you know, you can knock people out their wheelchair. And these guys were going, yeah, you can knock people out their wheelchair. It's wicked. You should come try it. So I went, okay, I'll give it a go. But then I'll be honest with you, I went home and I Googled it. And I was watching these videos on YouTube of people getting smashed out of their wheelchair. And I went, ooh, don't know if I want to go and try this. But I went down to try it. And the very first session I went to, this player called Manny, who played for Great Britain, came flying across the court and smashed me out of my chair. I'd never been smashed out of a wheelchair before. But I laid there on the floor all calm and still. And I went, well, I want to hit you back. And it brought out a dark side of me that I didn't know I had, Maria. It turns out I love smashing people out of their wheelchair. And that's kind of how it blew up from there, really.
Oh my God, I love that. I love the fact that it's nothing like rugby, but you had to call it that in order to actually make it. I did wonder why it was called rugby. It isn't, you're right, it's on a basketball. And I mean, I would be petrified to sort of have people coming at me, smashing me out of my wheelchair. And I can get up and pick myself up much more easily. Have you had lots of injuries?
Yeah, I won't go into too much detail on the classification system, but I'm basically the least disabled person on my team as an amputee. Because I got on my tummy muscles, I've got on my core, but that means it's my role to be the big bully and kind of intimidate and, you know, mess up, like kind of hit other people really hard. But, you know, this is elite sport. It's not a tickling competition. So if someone was going to score a point and I wanted to stop them, I would charge at them as fast as I can. Because if they fall out and land on my lap, then that's a foul on them.
Wow.
It's a bit like chess with violence.
Wow, but you haven't told me about injuries. Have you been injured?
Oh, sorry,
this?
No, I didn't, did I? No, well, and that's my point. It's normally me kind of injuring other people, but we won't go into that, maybe.
Oh,
that's
okay.
My goal. No, I will say, if you look at able-bodied rugby, though, they're crazy. They run into each other with their bodies. We run into each other with our wheelchairs. So it's our wheelchairs that break more than we do. So touch wood, it's rare that anyone would have a kind of a serious injury.
Okay, and so I'm sorry, I'm fascinated by this. So if you've got an expensive sports wheelchair, how much do they cost to replace if you do damage it?
Well, yeah, my chair costs £4,000, and I get through one a year because I twist and buckle them and crack them. I took 2 wheelchairs to the games. I shouldn't tell you this, but I took 2 wheelchairs to the Paralympics. So people went, why has he got 2 wheelchairs? And they said, oh, because he cracks them and, you know, he has to buy new ones just to intimidate people. But I shouldn't have told you that.
Oh, that's clever. We all know now for next time. So that's interesting. So, yeah, I'm not going to edit that out. Now, listen, you know, all this violence is completely opposite to who you are because you're a big family man. And we know that. And COVID meant that you couldn't take your family to the Paralympics. How did that affect your performance? How did that affect you, you know, as a person?
Yeah, it was tough. I competed in the 2012 Paralympics, where as a team, we came 5th. So that was the end of that story. I started wheelchair rugby, and 3 years later, I competed in London as a kind of rookie player. I stepped down from wheelchair rugby after London because I did it all around the wrong way, married, mortgage, elite athlete, didn't really ever work. And I went back in 2017. And the reason I went back was because I wanted to take my daughters to a games. I thought, how cool would it be to get to come watch their daddy compete? And you know, I didn't think they'd postponed the Paralympics when COVID kicked off. I thought it happened behind closed doors. you don't cancel the biggest sporting event in the world. You know, that happens every 4 years like clockwork. So when it got postponed, it was really tough to deal with as an athlete. It was also really tough that when it was going to happen again a year later, there was going to be no spectators. But my family supported me from home. So they were watching on the telly. My girls were watching and supporting and cheering. And, you know, I've got it here to come away and win this shiny gold medal. Just get that in there.
We can't see that on the podcast.
No, we can't see it on the podcast. I'm holding up my gold medal. I'm very, very proud of this. So to go all the way for them and to win this was phenomenal.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, I mean, at each stage of your life so far, and you're still young, you've sort of had to deal with resilience. You've had to be resilient. Where's that come from? Where have you found this resilience?
I think the common misconception is people think that when you've been through something like I have with meningitis and you become an amputee, that instantly makes you resilient. I don't think that does. I think being poorly, what that did was made me very aware of my mortality, which in turn made me take opportunities like doing the wheelchair racing for charity, trying wheelchair rugby. That made me take opportunities, which then taught me to be resilient because I put myself out of my comfort zone. So, you know, before London, I was training around a full-time job and getting up at 5 a.m. to be in the gym before work. And, you know, and doing those kind of sessions when you're absolutely broken, you know, and then going into a team meeting and not really knowing what my own name was, that's when you learn to be resilient. I mean, we haven't spoken about Kilimanjaro, but that was a charity challenge that I took on that blew up, and I ended up crawling on my hands and knees for a number of days to get to the summit of Kilimanjaro. You know, that's when you learn resilience. So I think resilience is a skill that can be learned. It's like a muscle, you know, if you train yourself a bit like in my sport, I go to the gym and I lift weights to make my muscles bigger. You can make yourself more resilient by putting yourself out of your comfort zone and taking on new challenges and opportunities. You know, a really obvious one is take up a charity challenge. If someone out there is thinking, you know, okay, we've been through COVID, I want to do something new, where can I start? Take up a charity challenge. As soon as you've been sponsored by someone, you cannot back out. So I'm always stitching people up with that, because they'll say, I'm thinking of taking on a charity challenge. I wave a tenner at them. There you go, I've sponsored you. Who are you doing it for? And at that point, as soon as you've been sponsored, you have to go through with it.
I'm not sure a tenner would be enough for me, actually. We have to talk about that. I'd need more than that as a motivation.
I'm sure you are.
So a couple of things there. I think actually that's really interesting that, you know, your story, your meningitis story, you're saying it didn't make you more resilient, but it made you look at things differently. I think there's a nice parallel there with all that we've been through with COVID. Do you think COVID will make people look at things differently? Do you think there are parallel lessons from your experience to what's happened now for us?
Yes, I think before I talk about this, I'll just say that I'm talking about sport, and I get that when I refer to COVID, because the games getting postponed, really that's nothing compared to some of the situations that some people have been through, losing loved ones, etc. So I get that I'm just talking about sport here, but yeah, there is. I think people are starting to look at things very differently, aren't they? And they're starting to. It was such a big disruptor, wasn't it? In the way that we just plodded along with going from A to B, that actually I think now people are trying to branch out, try new things, set up new businesses, take their life in a different direction. That's when they're going to learn to be resilient, because they're going to do things that perhaps they wouldn't have done pre-COVID. Does that make sense? So I think I'm a massive believer in the kind of, you know, there's a positive that can be found in a negative. And as bad as COVID's been, it's also maybe given us a big wake-up call as well, and that's made us take opportunities, perhaps. You know, I had to lose 30% of my body before I started to use 100% of what was left. You know, COVID could be your 30%. You know, where has it put you back? What could you do moving forward?
That's fantastic words. I love that. It's a strong parallel, absolutely. And a lot of people have lost a lot, and we appreciate that. But of course, you have lost 30% of your body, as you say. Kilimanjaro, you mentioned it. Tell us the story.
Yeah, okay. So I've kind of spoiled the end a little bit, but haven't I? But yeah, so the idea was that was a charity challenge. And when I'd stepped down from playing rugby after 2012, the Meningitis Research Foundation approached me, who I do my fundraising for, and asked me if I fancied it. I agreed to it on a whim. Again, I often agree to things I perhaps shouldn't. And we looked into it. Other people have been up Kili in a chair, but they've been carried to the top. Although I'm an amputee and I've got prosthetic legs, I've got bad scars on my legs, so I never would have been able to walk up the mountain. I was going to have to try and use a wheelchair. So we set this goal to become the first person in the world to get to the top of Kilimanjaro in a chair, but without any assistance, which seemed like a good idea when we set that goal. I got myself a specially adapted wheelchair called a mountain trike, and we flew out to Tanzania and we set off. Day one was meant to take between 2 and 3 hours. The chair was never going to cope. It took 6 hours in the chair. The next day was meant to take between 4 and 5 hours. It took us 10.5 hours. I should probably explain, it takes most people 6 days to get to the summit, able-bodied people. At that point, they said, we're going to have to carry you. And I said, under no uncertain terms, that's not happening. And it got very heated on the side of a mountain in Tanzania. We were almost screaming at each other. But I had some knee pads with me. I knew that I could move faster out of my wheelchair than I could in my wheelchair. And I had a really technical piece of mountaineering equipment with me called duct tape. So I duct taped my knee pads to my legs. I jumped out of my wheelchair, refused any help from the guides, and I crawled on my hands and knees for 4 days to get to the summit.
Wow. Wow. I don't know if you're crazy or just incredibly brave. And how long did it take you to recover physically from that?
It took about 6 weeks. And it's funny when you say, am I bonkers or brave? I didn't realize what I was doing, Maria. I'm very stubborn. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to get carried up this mountain. That's not happening. And it just seemed normal for me to do that. And it wasn't until I got home and I started telling people the story. And they'd say, what happened? I said, oh, I just crawled to get to the top because I wasn't going to be carried. And people would go, sorry, what? What do you mean you crawled? And it was at that moment I kind of realized what I'd actually achieved. And it was really, really humbling. And that's something I speak about now.
Fantastic. And you were the first person to do that?
Yes, yeah. But as we understand it, first person with my level of disability. I mean, the guides have been doing it for years and they said they've never seen anybody crawl up the mountain. So, yeah, first person.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, amazing. I mean, we can hear from the way you speak anyway that you're absolutely passionate about what you do. You're passionate as well about sports psychology. And I know that you personally made some big changes from 2012 to 2020. Can you talk us through some of those changes?
Okay, yeah. So in 2012, I should probably set the scene with this. We came fifth. So we did our best as a team. We were quite a young, fresh squad. I've already mentioned I'm a high point player, so I carry a lot of the team's points when we're competing. And I don't know if I just got some bad advice or I just presumed this is what elite athletes did. But before games, I'd get myself really hyped up. So I'm one of life's natural worriers. I catastrophize. So some of my teammates can switch that off and they can just go into a game and not care, but I care. And I start to think about silly things, oh my gosh, everybody's watching me. What if I throw the ball the wrong way? Oh my gosh, I'm going to make mistakes. This could mean we lose £2 million worth of funding for my squad. So to get my brain in a place where I thought I needed to be, I'd get myself really hyped up. So I'd be there before a game listening to really loud dance music. I would be like punching the ceiling, drinking isotonic energy drinks, whooping and hollering. But I was really, being honest, in a complete state of fight or flight all the time. And I didn't realize this. And when I went back in 2017 to the squad, I started working with a new psychologist from Chimp Management. And he works under that umbrella. And it's the idea that your brain is much better when it's in a calm, composed state. So we would look at our pre-game processes. So before a game, before London, as I said, completely hyped up, punching the ceiling. And he kind of explained to me that I was getting myself completely overstimulated. So we started to look at new pre-game processes. So we practiced them over a number of years on the build up to the games. Sometimes I didn't stimulate myself enough, so I wouldn't be hyped up enough and I'd be too complacent going into a match. And it really was a learning curve. But as we went into the Tokyo 2020 games, I had my processes nailed down and they were as follows. I have a list of points I'm working on at any given time.
You're going to show me, aren't you? Which is always good on a podcast, but we're going to describe.
Yeah, I know. Some people might be watching it, but yeah, I've got a list of points that I'm working on at any given time.
So that's an A4 piece of paper where you've literally handwritten.
You know what? I always meant to write this up neat and I didn't. And this actually came with me to the Paralympics. And it's things that I'm working on. So scanning to limit options, compose but 10 seconds dribble. They're just little points that I'm working on. I like the logic, but you can never be the finished article, and you can always be better. So that's why I have my list of notes that I'm working on before a game, and that helps keep me calm. And my second pre-game process now, versus before London, is that I like to have a cup of tea. So I sit in the changing room and I have a cup of tea, and I find that helps keep me calm, just about the right amount of caffeine. And it's very British as well, isn't it? Have a cup of tea before we go to war. And that's what I try and do before I go into the game. But we're now at a point where we're trying to work with other people to support them, other athletes, if I can help them. Because if I think some of the emotional turmoil that I've been through, you know, with my worrying state and the way that I was trying to hype myself up, I hope that other people don't have to go through that. And if I can help someone else, then that's really important for me.
Actually, you know, I'm a warrior, so I would benefit from that. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there in business, in organizations, a lot of leaders who are worried. You know, we're worried about what's happening at the moment. We're still in a state of uncertainty. And, you know, people are worried not only about the pandemic still being around, but also about climate change, about all sorts of things. So actually, I think that's really interesting. I think that's very valuable. I love what you said there, never the finished article. And that you're passionate about that, aren't you? That you're on a journey, and that I'm sure that, and you like to work with people who are in that similar mindset, aren't they? That they also feel they're on a journey, they're not finished, there's more to accomplish. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. Anybody who's trying to progress or move forwards. I still am in my sport. I'm still competing. I'd like to compete in the Paris 2024 Paralympics. You know, I hope that I don't get injured and my shoulders hold out. I'd really like to take my girls to a games. But I like that thought that you're always on a journey and you can always be better. And I like to work with people to help them achieve that, or maybe question what they're doing, or work in a different way. I certainly find that beneficial to listen to other speakers myself, or to you know, listen to your podcast, Maria, and find out what people are up to. Any sort of nuggets you can get from that to help you progress are really important.
Let's finish on what's next. So you mentioned 2024 Olympics. What else?
Yeah, I'd like to go to the 2024 games, and I don't think it's ever stop. I think my thing will be finding things that people haven't done in a wheelchair, and then trying to conquer them. I think that would be my thing moving forward.
Things that people haven't done in a wheelchair. Okay, if you would like to write in and challenge Aaron on his next adventure, things that people haven't done in a wheelchair, please do. And thank you for your time. It's been lovely to host you. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. Thank you, everybody, for listening to The Speaker Show. If you enjoy this episode, please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. And you can keep up with future episodes on the Speakers Associates website, which is speakersassociates.com. If you'd like to book Aaron for your next conference, please make sure you get in touch with Speakers Associates in plenty of time so that you won't be disappointed. I'll see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.